Of course, darling, come with me. We're gonna have some time. We're gonna have some fun. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That you're gonna ride with the cars. Of course, darling, no one can against them. So come on. Of course, darling, we're gonna forget about all them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. That we're gonna have party. We're gonna have fun. And no one is gonna touch us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, come with me. That is what you can have. That you're gonna have party. No one is gonna touch us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So come on. Of course, darling, we're gonna ride. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, I give a damn. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. That I'm gonna be so high. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. That I'm so high. That I'm gonna have some fun. No one is gonna bother me. And us, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. That we're gonna have so much fun. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. So come on, let's go to the beach, please. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. That we are so fun. That we are so fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. So come on, darling, I love you so much. You know that. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That we're gonna go to the top of the mountain and we're gonna shoot ourselves. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, come with me. That is what you can have. That no one can against us. That we're gonna have party, we're gonna have fun, and no one is gonna bother us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That we are in North 1054 XHB. Of course, darling, come with me and let us count our money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That they want us more fat. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. I have this more fat. Of course, darling, but let them there. That is what you can have. That I don't need them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are so crazy with their ring in Notre Dame. Of course, darling, they are burning there. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So I don't want that. Let them burn in Notre Dame if that is what they want. Of course, darling, I'm with them engaged at 9 o'clock and no one can against me. So come on. Of course, darling, you have to pink Harley's more fat, but let them there, darling, I don't need them. They're so crazy with Notre Dame burning there. Of course, darling, let them there. I'm at them engaged at 9 o'clock. Of course, darling, you don't have 219s. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That if you have 219, you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And if you have a ring in Notre Dame, you have to go to the beach, please, and confess in the confessionary and burn, because that is what you're gonna do in Notre Dame. If you not confess, I regret it. Of course, darling, let them there. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That if you come with a mic cross, we are burning too, shooting at the devil. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are all gone. Of course, darling, let's go to the cage at 9 o'clock with the people. darling, and no one can against us. Of course, darling, we're gonna have so much fun. We're gonna be so fine, and we're gonna have party and fun, and no one is gonna bother us. Of course, darling, we're gonna go to the top of the mountain and love ourselves. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have that no one can against us. So come on, darling, that is what chicken say. That we're gonna ride and no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what chicken say. That no one can against us. That I love you so much. Of course, darling, we're with no swans at 054 at XHV. Of course, darling, I love you so much. Kisses, I love you.